These are the words of Emil Cioran, a philosopher often called the poet of nihilism, who spent his entire existence writing about despair, futility, and the absurdity of being alive. By all accounts, he should have been consumed by his own pessimism. And yet, he wasn't. Cioran lived 84 years, not in misery, but in a strange, almost playful acceptance of life's emptiness. You can say he kind of became an optimist, because once you dig deep enough into pessimism, past depression, past hopelessness, you reach a place most people never imagine. At the very bottom of despair, there's a hidden form of freedom, a dark optimism that even the Stoics could never achieve. His nihilism wasn't a curse. It became his way of enjoying life without expectations. And in this video, I will explore the 3 stages Cioran followed that made his long life not just bearable, but strangely fulfilling. So let's get into it. Emil Cioran was born in 1911 in the small mountain town of Rușinari, Romania. The son of an Orthodox priest, he grew up in a deeply religious household, surrounded by ritual, faith, and the heavy weight of tradition. Yet, even as a child, he sensed something different within himself. Instead of inheriting the comfort of belief, he began to question it. The young Cioran didn't look at life as a divine gift, but as an accident he never asked for. By the time he was a student in Bucharest, studying philosophy, he was already wrestling with questions most people spend their lives avoiding. At just 23 years old, Cioran published his first book, On the Heights of Despair, a work born out of sleepless nights and endless inner storms. It was not the voice of a hopeful young man, but of one who already felt the unbearable weight of existence. His words revealed a philosophy that would haunt him for the rest of his life. I am simply an accident. Why take it all so seriously? This became the cornerstone of his thought. If life itself is nothing more than an accident, then why drag it down with grand illusions of purpose, progress, or destiny? In his 20s, Cioran tried desperately to carve out an identity that would separate him from his ancestors, who lived ordinary lives of faith and survival. He wanted to rebel against tradition, to break free of all inherited meaning. For him, existence wasn't a gift, it was exile. He once asked in despair, "Is it possible that existence is our exile, and nothingness our home?" These questions reveal the heart of his nihilism, the sense that life is a burden, a cosmic mistake, and that consciousness itself is a curse. He often envied animals, believing it would be better to live with a dim awareness, free from the torment of thinking too much. To be a creature of instinct seemed to him more bearable than to be a human, doomed to confront questions that have no answers. Because of this worldview, critics labeled him the darkest pessimist of the 20th century, and some even called him the philosopher of suicide. His philosophy of existence leaned heavily toward antinatalism, the belief that it might be better never to have been born at all. Yet here lies the paradox. Cioran did not end his life. He endured, and not only endured, he wrote, reflected, and somehow found a way to keep living. But his path was not without grave mistakes. In his youth, hungry for direction and meaning, he became briefly involved with the Iron Guard, a far-right nationalist movement in Romania aligned with Hitler's ideology. Like many restless young thinkers, he believed he had found a cause, a purpose to ease his inner void. But this was a decision he would later deeply regret. In later writings, he condemned his own political naivety, admitting that even the search for meaning in destructive ideologies could not solve the human condition. The question of existence, the why live, always returned. This is the fate of many great thinkers. Some turned to faith, some to absurdism, some to nihilism. But Cioran was different. He stayed with nihilism, staring into it without blinking, and instead of being destroyed, he somehow found contentment. Unlike others who softened their philosophy to make life easier, Cioran leaned into despair and discovered a strange freedom on the other side. No one lived more content as a nihilist than he did. But how exactly did Cioran manage to live for 84 years with this philosophy, transforming despair into a bearable existence? That is something we will explore in the final chapter of this video. But before we reach that point, we must first understand where people go wrong, and why most of us struggle to endure what Cioran somehow learned to embrace. One of Emil Cioran's most haunting insights is that the search for purpose itself can destroy us. Most people believe that life will make sense if only they attach themselves to the right ideology, the right movement, or even the right illusion. History is full of men and women who fell into this trap, searching for meaning not within themselves, but in the promises of leaders, religions, and even cults. Cioran himself was not immune. As I mentioned earlier, he joined the Iron Guard. For a time, he thought that maybe purpose could be manufactured through belonging to a cause. But this was a mistake he later regretted for the rest of his life. Ideologies, he came to realize, do not resolve the absurdity of existence. They only disguise it for a while, often at a terrible cost. Cioran also warned against another illusion, the belief that knowledge and consciousness are pathways to liberation. We live in a world that constantly preaches that the more aware, the more informed, the more conscious we are, the closer we get to truth and freedom. Yet Cioran inverted this idea completely. For him, consciousness was not a gift, it was a curse. The more you think, the heavier life becomes. He once wrote with brutal clarity, "Better to be an animal than a man, an insect than an animal," and so on. Salvation? Whatever diminishes the kingdom of consciousness and compromises its supremacy. This was not just a philosophical metaphor. It was his lived reality. Cioran suffered from insomnia for most of his life, and tragically, so did his wife. Nights of endless wakefulness meant nights of endless thinking, a torture he could never escape. Consciousness never let him rest. It gnawed at him day and night. For him, insomnia was the perfect symbol of human existence, condemned to stay awake, condemned to think when all you want is peace. This burden of consciousness also made him one of the fiercest advocates of antinatalism. The idea that it is better never to have been born than to suffer the endless weight of existence. He believed life is not a blessing, but a wound, and that bringing more beings into it only multiplies pain. But even in this bleak outlook, Cioran discovered truths that most people are too afraid to face. He argued that happiness itself is a dangerous illusion. He believed that when people chase happiness, they are really chasing shadows, mistaking fleeting moments of relief for some permanent state. To him, this pursuit of happiness was not a triumph, but a sign of despair. Why? Because every fulfilled desire only gives birth to new ones. The satisfaction is never complete. It always comes back, demanding more, and often with an even heavier price. In his view, happiness is a trick existence plays on us to keep us clinging to life. But the question here arises, what is the real way? And this is what I'm going to discuss now, ways that no one else has ever taught, but that Cioran embodied for 84 long years. Now that we've understood Emil Cioran's concept of life and the mistakes people make in their pursuit of purpose, it's time to ask, what was his solution? How did a self-proclaimed nihilist manage to live not only long, but fully? The answer, surprisingly, is simple, but not that simple. You will understand this line at the last minute of my video. Cioran never ran away from his depression. He allowed despair to pass through him, to leave its mark, and then he turned it into words. He often admitted that he needed sadness in order to write. Without melancholy, without insomnia, without the weight of despair, his books would never have existed. In this sense, he was the father of despair. Like Kafka, but even more complicated. He transformed nihilism into art, building a life not on hope, but on honesty. He called himself a kind of proud loser, one who had learned to laugh at the accident of being alive. As he once implied, let this accident not be the reason for your sadness. His outlook had shades of Stoicism, but with an existential twist. For the Stoics, endurance came from reason and discipline. For Cioran, endurance came from surrender, letting despair wash over you, and then turning it into something creative. Even sleep for him was not simply rest, but rebirth. He once wrote, "In every man sleeps a prophet, and when he wakes, there is a little more evil in the world." Sleep was his way of resetting, of dying a little and being born again. It was his most intimate form of liberation. But Cioran also warned against chasing a single, fixed answer to the problem of existence. For him, life should be divided into provisional solutions, temporary paths that help us endure the absurd. There is no ultimate cure for life's suffering. There are only fragments, moments of relief, small escapes that we must embrace whenever they appear. For one person, it might be music. For another, beauty. For him, it was both. And above all, writing. This is where Cioran becomes truly paradoxical and even dangerous to read. He told us not to seek purpose, and yet he found one in writing. He mocked illusions, but found beauty in music. He called happiness despair, but still clung to little joys that helped him keep going. This is what makes him tricky. If you misunderstand him, you may fall deeper into despair than ever before. But if you read him carefully, you'll see the hidden optimism that carried him through 84 years of life. He was firmly against suicide, not because he thought life was precious, but because by the time you decide to do it, it's already too late. His defiance of death was not heroic, but ironic, a shrug at the absurdity of our existence. So how did Cioran live fully? Or did he? I would leave that question for you to answer, and I would end my video on this quote by him. "The world begins and ends with us only. Our consciousness exists. In enjoying this, everything vanishes with it. Dying, we leave nothing. Then why so much fuss around an event that is no such thing?